Hi, my name is Alex. I run an online business selling used video games and media on Amazon and eBay. And I'm currently doing around 300k in turnover, and around 80-90 grand of that is profit. So it's quite a good business. It's been going for 6 years in all for now. So I'm 22 currently. I started at about 16 during COVID, and I wanted to talk about how I think my age has impacted my business, because I think that in part it's been a massive help, and in part it's probably been a bit of a hindrance. But overall, I'm very glad that I started business at such a young age. Like I said, I started doing it when I was 16. So the way it started was that it was during COVID, and, you know, school was off. I mean, we had online school, but who was really doing that? Let's be honest. So I was pretty bored. You play video games all day, every day for the first couple months, but it gets a bit old eventually, right? So I wanted a job, right? I wanted to get a job, but I couldn't get a job because, it was COVID. I wanted to go, stack shelves at the local Tesco, but they weren't recruiting because of COVID. And I was like, well, what do I do then? So I ended up kind of inheriting some of my mum's old eBay supplies. So when my mum had me and my brother, she, didn't go to her job, right? Because maternity. And so she wanted to stay home and, bring us up. And so she sold stuff on eBay, and she built a decent business around it. She did stop doing that because she went back into, more traditional employment. But she had supplies, she had knowledge, and so she basically was like, Alex, you can't get an actual job right now, but you can sell stuff on eBay, and I'll give you these bits to get going, right? So that was a massive help, and I ended up selling some old video games that I had lying around, and I was like, whoa, that is crazy. Those things are selling quick and for good money. What if I can get more of these, right? And that's how it started, and it built from there. And it was great starting out because I didn't need money, right? I didn't need to buy anything. I was 16. I was obviously living in my parents' house, eating the food my parents were buying, going to school. I had no expenses, right? So it meant that all money that I had, I could just put into the business, which was brilliant. Buying more stock, and, don't get me wrong, it was incredibly slow, like for the first year or two. But that's how it's supposed to be. And I could only dedicate, a couple hours to it a night after school and after doing my homework. And I would spend all day on Saturday and Sunday on it as well, which was also good because, again, as like a 16, 17-year-old, I didn't really have responsibilities. Yeah, I might go to like the occasional party on the weekend, but I wasn't like massively social, so it would be very occasional. So I could just put most of my time into growing the business, which was great. And I think part of the success of it was that I didn't need money from it. So it was okay that it grew very slowly, right? Making like 600 quid a month, 700 quid a month turnover. So maybe my profit was like 300-400. I mean, Christ, for like a 16, 17-year-old, that's great. Like that's amazing. So I think, had I started doing that post-university when, I actually need an income, then it becomes hard to justify. It's like, well, if you're only making 400 quid a month, 100 quid a week, you're working 7 days on it, like, what, are you making like 15 quid a day? Like, that's not worth your time as a 22-year-old. So I think that helped me a lot, because I could go through those early stages making a very small amount of money, but being like, wow, this can grow from here, and I've got nothing better to do. You know what I mean? So that was a massive advantage for me. And I think that if you are a teenager, that is a big opportunity, because you don't need the money, which means that any amount of money you make is a massive win. And it means you can try lots of different ways of making money. This business that I do now, right, it doesn't work in the same way that it did when I started. You know, I don't make my money by going around my parents' loft looking for old video games to sell, right? But that also wasn't the first business that I tried. I tried many things before that when I was like 13, 14, 15. Because again, I was just bored and I wanted to make money. And I lived in a very, very rural area, like a small village in one of the least populated counties in England. Well, in the UK as a whole, actually. So I had nothing better to do, which if you live in a city, maybe that's a bit different. I don't really know. I'm not a fan of cities personally, but the fact that I was able to try lots of different things, see what worked, and once something clicked, which, you know, the eBay stuff for me did during COVID, then I could start doing that more and really enjoy the process as well, because again, any amount of money was a huge, huge win. And so it went from there, right? Like, I kept building it up. I was in sixth form doing my A-levels. Yeah, I had to put some effort into the exams, but honestly, they weren't that difficult. So I mostly spent time, you know, hanging out with my mates and working on the business on weekends in particular. And again, you know, making $1,000 a month or something like that, fantastic money at that age for me. I didn't need any money really, but it meant that I didn't have to ask my parents for money for anything, which I really liked. I really liked that. I don't like asking my parents for things, and I just haven't really asked them for anything since I was, you know, 17, 18. So that was a big thing for me. But things changed a lot after sixth form, because I had that summer, and that summer I also passed my driving test, which meant, and this was when I was 18 after my A-levels, and so I could really start putting lots of time into the business. And because I deal in physical products, being able to travel more easily by car meant that I could get more, I could sell more. I had that summer to basically try to prove the concept of my business. And I remember when I went to university after that summer, the business was doing well. I ended up having to pay my brother to ship my items out for me once they sold, because I couldn't be at home, right? I was at university. But also, I realized once I turned 18, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to university. I'm not going to be able to ship items out very easily, am I? Because I'm going to be at uni. So this is not going to be very scalable. So how am I going to get around this? And that's when I started doing Amazon, because I was like, well, if I do Amazon FBA, I can go home on weekends, right? Send items out to Amazon, and then once they sell, Amazon will just ship it out for me. And so I could front load my work basically, right? So I started doing that, and that was brilliant. I would often go, so I went to university in Birmingham, so that was a massive place, far, far bigger than where I'm from, right? And so I would often go sourcing for products in and around Birmingham. And I would often actually, oh my God, I used to use the e-scooters, the electric scooters in Birmingham. I went through some rough places there, going to like shops and that where I would get the products. I wouldn't do that now for sure. Youthful ignorance, I suppose. And you know, I would be in my uni room and be packing these products up to send to Amazon, and then putting it on an e-scooter, like this massive box that would weigh like 20 kilos, taking it on an e-scooter or an e-bike to a UPS drop-off shop. Christ, I don't know how I managed that. I mean, it was pretty impressive, not gonna lie. It must have looked ridiculous. like strapping this 20 kilo cardboard box like onto the front of an e-scooter. I don't know, but point is that I was realizing that there are levels to this game. Basically, it doesn't have to be that, you know, I go to some charity shops in the local area to source items, go to the car boot on a weekend in the summer and put them up on eBay. Now, eBay is great, don't get me wrong, and I have been ratcheting up my eBay recently, actually, and I've been enjoying it, right? It's great. But it wasn't very practical for when I was at uni, again, just because of location constraints. So it forced me to adapt. And I think that if you're doing business and starting when you're young, you're going to be forced to adapt as well, because your life is going to change so significantly compared to when you're older, where things are more steady. Like, the system forces your life to change dramatically and often when you're young. You know, things change a lot once you can drive. Things change a lot once you go to uni. Things change a lot once you move out. All those things. That doesn't really happen once you're in your mid-20s. Not so drastically anyway. So, I started doing that. And that was going well. And then it started stagnating a bit. And then I was like, okay, this is fine. But going out and physically sourcing these items around Birmingham is just too time intensive. And at that point, I'd built up like a decent amount of money in the business bank account, maybe like 10 grand or something. So I'm like, all right. And again, I didn't really have to pay myself because I had my student loan. So again, that was a massive bonus, because if I was an adult, I'd have to be paying myself. I'd probably have to go get an actual job alongside the business, because I wouldn't have been making enough money to pay myself enough to live, right? And I suppose you can kind of recreate the scenario if you are in your 20s by just living with your parents while you get things off the ground, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, you're gonna feel far more pressure to move out than I did when I was in my teens and then at university in my 20s, where I didn't really need the income because I had my student loan, right? So I think it was kind of like an artificial bubble that I could be in and grow the business while I was in that artificial bubble. And I knew there was like a time limit to it. I knew there was a time limit because once my uni course ended, I needed the business to be making enough money for me to live on. You know what I mean? Because if it didn't, well, I'd have to get an actual job, and I didn't want an actual job. So yeah, I was like, okay, I can't really go out sourcing all these items physically. I've got, you know, I've got uni. I also played chess professionally. I was playing football. I was doing kickboxing at a decent level. I was doing a lot of things. So I was like, well, I don't have the time for this. And so I started sourcing my products online, because I was like, well, I've got 10 grand sitting there in the bank. Even if my profit margins shrink, because I have this stack of money that I've been working like 4 years to build up, I can make that money work for me now. And the money didn't have to leave the business and go into my personal bank account to be used for things like food and rent because I had my student loan, right? I just think that's so powerful that I was able to do that. And, you know, once I started sourcing products online, spending thousands online to source products, the business just took off, completely took off in the space of the last couple years. And yeah, like I said, now I'm at like, you know, 300 grand turnover. I expect 2026 to be about 350, maybe 400 grand in turnover, probably about 120 grand profit, which is just nuts. And all of these things that I've been talking about allowing me to grow the business at a steady and safe rate because I was young and I started off young, I think was so powerful. Now, I'm not saying you can't start a business if you're older. I'm not saying that. But I think it's more difficult. Like, if you're older and you've moved out of home, you know, you will probably need to have a job, like an actual job, and work on the business on the side. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. But there's pros and cons to both. There's pros and cons to starting business when you're young and starting business when you're older. I'm just telling you the pros that I personally found from starting a business when I was young. And those, like, basically the lack of responsibility and the lack of expenses, I think you can leverage. I think really can be leveraged. So I hope this made sense. I hope this was enjoyable. I hope this was useful. But yeah, if you are starting a business, regardless of your age, be careful, because most businesses fail. That's just a fact. But if you know your numbers, then crack on. If it does fail, it's not the end of the world, is it? I've had lots of like ideas for businesses that I've started and then abandoned because they just haven't worked, or they haven't made enough money per unit of time or whatever, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. For the vast majority of people, your first business probably will fail, and that is fine. That's not a problem. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if it helps anybody out there, then fantastic.